1918, when Mary Beth told him about the stranger in more detail. Eugene didn't like to look at him. The man was slender, pale-skinned and dark-haired, his clothes impeccable and his nails neatly manicured where his hands rested folded in his lap. He didn't look like the sort of man who worked for a living, which was reason enough for the folks of Chanlarvier to ignore him, but it was more than that. There was something about him that exuded the quiet air of a predator in wait, cold-blooded and basking in the sun, his animal eyes fixed on Mary Beth, who never seemed concerned in the slightest. The man made Eugene uneasy, but Mary Beth was unbothered by his presence. She never gave him a name, and she never offered to introduce them properly, for which Eugene was grateful. "He looks out for me," Mary Beth said in her matter-of-fact way, not looking up from braiding her daisy chain. "You don't have to talk to him. He won't bother you." "Does he bother you?" Eugene asked. "No. Sometimes he goes away for days at a time, off to the Bayou or someplace." She didn't sound particularly interested in where he went or what he did. "Either way, I'm used to pretending he's not here." "Is that what Father Latimer does?" She did pause then, and glanced sideways at Eugene, as if sizing him up. Eugene was 12 and coltish, his limbs splayed at awkward angles as he grew into them. Mary Beth was a year younger, still round-faced with baby fat, her knees and fingers stained green from the garden, though she was careful to keep her dress spotless. "No," she finally said. "Father Latimer can't see him." Eugene didn't know what to make of that. "Is he a ghost?" Louisiana was teeming with ghosts. At 12, he knew all the stories. Mary Beth's stranger didn't look how he pictured them, but he inspired the same response. A cold, shivery feeling that ran up and down Eugene's spine, like he was looking at something he wasn't supposed to see. "He's not a ghost," Mary Beth said. "He's very solid. You can touch him if you want." Eugene shook his head and returned to his daisy chain. He didn't want to touch the man. He didn't even want to see his face. "Mama says I shouldn't talk about him," she continued, "so you'll have to keep him a secret." Like the Rougarou curse. "What happens if I talk?" Eugene whispered, dry-mouthed. But Mary Beth just shrugged. "Nothing much. Mama calls him my imaginary friend. He doesn't mind us talking, but no one else will believe it. She says if I tell the priest about him, the church will try to drive him out like the devil." Eugene snuck a glance back over his shoulder. "Is he the devil?" "Don't know. I don't like talking to the priest anyhow." Mary Beth twisted the final flower stems together and placed the crown on her head, as primly as any imagined princess. "Mama says I need to go to confession every week so people don't ask questions, but I don't like it. Don't tell anyone that either. Apparently it ain't right to spread rumors about a priest." Eugene never had anything as interesting as the devil to talk about in confession, but the thought of taking the stranger into the church made his stomach turn over and his palms itch. The man seemed misplaced enough in the courtyard, but in the church itself, in the quiet shadows of the confessional, there was something sacrilegious about it. The stranger didn't belong anywhere near Christian ground. "I won't tell," Eugene said. An hour later, his mother came to collect him, and as he rose and brushed the earth from his knees, he looked up at just the wrong moment and caught the stranger's gaze across the yard. He froze, his heart flooded with some nameless primal dread. The man leaned forward on the bench, his elbows on his knees, black suit sharp in the sun, and he crooked his finger, beckoning Eugene closer. Eugene looked to his mother, but as Mary Beth had promised, she seemed to look right through the man. Eugene took a step back and reached for her hand. The man sat up straighter and seemed to laugh, a soundless smile on his lips. A cloud passed overhead, its shadow drifting over the garden, and when Eugene blinked, the man was gone. That night, Eugene dreamt of Mary Beth walking hand in hand with the man, who was tall and slim as a cypress tree, dressed too finely to come from Chanlarvier, and who spoke with a hushed, secret voice Eugene couldn't remember on waking. In the dream, they turned as one to look at him, and Mary Beth put a finger to her lips, smiling. When Eugene woke, he crossed himself reflexively, though he had the unsettling feeling it wouldn't do any good. The dreams kept up all week. Every time he shut his eyes, he felt haunted. In the dreams, Mary Beth was ambivalent, and the man was a shadowy, intriguing figure that tugged at his attention, luring him deeper every night. Waking up became a struggle, consciousness a heavy weight, and he flinched from every shape and shadow, expecting to see the man solidify in the waking world. It was an unsettling sensation, but intoxicating too. Eugene doubled his prayers, head down and hands clasped till they were sweating. Lord, keep me. God, save me. Protect me from the eyes of that stranger. Save my soul from the hauntings I can't control. He didn't know whether he was more afraid of the stranger or of his reaction to him. On Saturday night, he dreamt he was in the church courtyard, rooted to the ground like the rose bushes. The air shivered around him, the flower petals trembling, silken against his skin. The man watched him from the church's shadow. Eugene couldn't see his face except for his eyes, which glittered sharply from the darkness and held Eugene enthralled. Even the roses had thorns to defend themselves, but Eugene had nothing. His anxiety clawed its way up his throat until he was choking on it, the air pressing in thick on all sides. The clouds dropped low to hang above his head like a ceiling, gray and oppressive with a threatening storm. The man raised one arm to point at something over Eugene's shoulder. His heart was cold in his chest, and he turned his head in slow motion to follow the line of the man's finger. He pointed into the bayou, into the mass of gnarled tree trunks, their branches hanging with Spanish moss like a mourner's veil. Staring into the fog, Eugene screamed inside his own head, begging himself to wake up before he saw whatever it was the man was pointing to. He couldn't blink, he couldn't look away. His eyes were frozen wide open, and he was sick with terror as he waited. Something huge lurched forward from behind the tree line. It walked hunched over but upright like a man, long-limbed with a pointed snout, its panting, slavering breaths growing louder and louder until they echoed all around the churchyard, the only thing Eugene could hear. The breeze shifted, and the beast caught Eugene's scent, swinging its great shaggy head around to find him. Father Latimer's eyes stared out at him from that distorted wolfish face, tongue lolling as its lip curled up in a snarl. The man's hand landed on Eugene's shoulder, and he jolted awake in bed, every muscle in his body locked, drenched with sweat. After Sunday Mass, when the church was empty, Eugene rose from his pew to walk the long line to the shrouded confessional booth. The man sat in the back row where the Burns had been during the service. Eugene resolutely straightened his spine and squared his shoulders and didn't look his way. The man watched him with passive curiosity, but made no move to follow him. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he intoned dutifully, as he had done every week since before he had the barest notion of sin. "I think there's something haunting me." "Haunting you?" asked Father Latimer. Eugene couldn't see him through the latticework of the confessional, but his voice was gentle, designed to put all manner of souls at ease. Eugene had never found solace in the confessional, nor in Father Latimer's company. There was something about the priest that put him on edge. Father Latimer was too composed, too careful in his acts and words to seem sincere, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. It was something Eugene had never voiced to anyone. It felt blasphemous, accusing a preacher of anything, no matter how small. But he avoided Father Latimer when he could, and kept his confessions short and impersonal. He would have kept them brief regardless. The other boys his age were just discovering the idea of sex and of girls, and spoke of both in strained, overeager whispers. Eugene avoided their conversations, eyes downcast and palms clammy. His lack of interest in girls was more damning than his peers' rabid pursuit of the subject, and he didn't need a priest to tell him he was going to hell. So instead, he bit his tongue and cycled through the same lesser sins week after week. He had disrespected his mother, he'd envied some other child at school. His real sins he kept between himself and God. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked. The church might be divided on the topic, but things were different in the South. There wasn't a God-fearing soul in Louisiana who didn't believe in ghosts as well as the great savior in the sky. There was voodoo in the soil, his mother always said, running in the water and making everyone half mad. Ghosts and rougarous and the devil wandering the streets and waiting to pull your soul down into the murky waters of the bayou. That's that. Thank you very much. There